Why, hello and welcome. So I have the video this week, and this week we're taking a little of a detour from the English pamphlet-y things that we have been looking at, and we are having a look at German fairy tales. Actually, to be specific, German fairy tales for adults. These aren't the Brothers Grimm, though we will talk about that because they are kind of linked. But I'm not reading all of the Brothers Grimm. I'm just not. So that's what we're talking about this week. But before we start, remember, as always, there is our shop. There is our bookshop where we have our books and our writing services. There is also our Redbubble shop where there are over 100 designs. It's a great way to support us. There's a thrill every time we sell something, even if it's a sticker, doesn't matter. I just love that people are finding and enjoying things that that have been made. And also, if you want to support us but you don't want to spend any money, that's fine. Like, subscribe, share, comment. All of those things help support us but don't cost you any money at all. So here we are, and we are having a look at this book. This book is a Penguin book, and it is in print. You can get it. This is my copy. It's really old. I think it's about 20 odd years old. I definitely bought it. Bought it when I was at uni. So I've had it for quite some time. And these are fairy tales, but they are fairy tales that are written for an adult audience. So they're from their romantic period, and they're German. They are by Goethe, Tieck, Foucault, and Britanno. I hope I have pronounced those correctly, but yeah, probably not. So the four stories. There is Goethe's, which heads out the book, and that is simply called A Fairy Tale. And that one is literally a fairy. They are literally fairy tales, but because they're literary fairy tales, because they are written by actual authors rather than folk tales, they do have a bit of a different structure, although they are doing their best to imitate the unlettered quality of folk tales. But try to remember any of these, it's not going to happen, because while they attempt to emulate the sort of beats of a folk tale, the language and the structure is very much a literary text. So we have, in fairy tale, we have will-o'-the-wisps, we have a river that has to be paid in a very particular way, we have these weird debts, we have a snake that eats gold and becomes luminescent and is finally able to see the underground kingdom, which sparks off a whole load of other things. There is a knight, there is a princess. It gets very convoluted. And apparently it's an allegory. But it made me think of the fact that the magic flute is an allegory. Das Zauberflöte, with its, 10-foot snakes and talking birds and bird catchers and wizard ladies and all the sorts of weird things that go on in the magic flute. And and much like the magic flute, or if you were initiated into Freemasonry, apparently you could read all this deep knowledge into the magic flute, but now it's just, hey, this one's cute and funny and you can watch it, and it's probably a good introduction to opera. that is sort of what happens to Goethe's fairy tale. It has these allusions to things, but outside of the cultural context, I have no idea. And this book doesn't have notes in the back to help me. So I'm reading this blind, and it's like, I don't know. So they have these incredible limitations. I will say that. The second one, which is by Ludwig Tieck, is called Ethelbert the Fair. This again has magical things. There's a magical bird. There is a little girl lost in the forest. There is running away. There is a secret. There are murders. And there's a trial that didn't get completed correctly and therefore resulted in everybody's downfall. Again, very literary. Again, very difficult to render as an oral text, but again, emulating an oral text. Ethelbert the Fair, turns out he married his own sister because she didn't do something, didn't follow the rules correctly. Really, I read that. I hadn't actually read this. I've had this book for 20 years and I hadn't read that one. But I read it and I was like, huh? What? I'm actually having a very similar experience reading this as I had to reading Elective Affinities. So if you're wondering about this, yeah, this is really culturally specific stuff. This is not temporal or culturally exportable in the same way that a lot of other things are. These are really they're in their time and place. And you know, Janice talked about you can't do close readings of texts for certain texts. This one, yeah, can't do a close reading of this thing. Yeah. So anyway, the next story is by Frederick de la Motte Fouque, which is called Undine, which I think is the best. It's the longest story in the book and is actually the story that I like the best. Undine is a water spirit. It's a story that is very much akin to The Little Mermaid by Hans Christian Andersen, which came, of course, later, and Dvorak's Rusalka, the Dvorak opera about the water spirit who falls in love with a prince and wants to marry him and ends up ultimately having to kill him because he broke the bargain, which is not something that The Little Mermaid has to do, mind you. Undine marries a prince. She's a water sprite, and she has been brought up by these fisherman and his wife, whose own daughter has been lost and has ended up being brought up by an aristocratic couple, and she's horrified to discover that she's related to fisherfolk. And the prince who Undine falls in love with because he sees her with the fisherfolk and thinks she's so charming and beautiful and wonderful, but she's also not quite human. She behaves in a way that's somewhat inappropriate. And they fall in love, and part of the danger for her, or for both of them, is if he does not love her back in accordance to how much her actual relatives believe is appropriate, then she will be reclaimed by them and not get a soul, and he will have to die. And they end up in this weird love triangle with the other woman, who is somewhat jealous of Undine, and they have a fight, but they have a fight on water, and that's it. All her relatives know, oh well, this was a bad idea. Tough luck. And then worse, so that was fine in terms of it's not going to kill him, but then he marries the other woman, and that's it. It's all over Red Rover for him. So that one is really interesting. I really like that one. It is more of a story rather than a folk tale. It's got a proper narrative. It's got actual consequences that make sense. A lot of these folk tales, because these are authors talking in terms of trying to emulate folk tales, and folk tales are not very causal, this becomes a bit of a problem. The final story, which is by Clemens Bretano, The Tale of Honest Caspar and Fair Anne, is the only one that is actually temporally set at the time, more or less, when it was written. It's the story of a young soldier, Caspar, and his girlfriend, Fair Anne, both of whom end up dead because they had a concept of honor. It is set in the Napoleonic period, around the same time as it was written. It's the only one that is like that. And it's the one with the least sort of supernatural types of qualities. There is a executioner and his sword and sort of more, but it feels more superstitious. But these characters have this concept of honor, which ultimately leads to their destruction. It's probably, it's not the most interesting of them. And again, all of these, apart from really Undine, are somewhat difficult to understand. Undine works like a proper narrative, as we would understand a proper narrative. You can read it, enjoy it. It's sort of like a Little Mermaid-esque tale, but nobody ends up turning into sea foam. Well, the mermaid doesn't. I really hated that as a kid. I got that as a little girl, and I read it, and I just thought that was horrible. So I rewrote the ending, where she killed the wife and got into bed. You know, isn't that what we all wanted? Isn't that what we all wanted after we read the real Hans Christian Andersen one and just thought, yeah, you know, I'm just saying. So I found Undine the best of the lot. Now, how do these stories fit into their context? That's really the thing that you need to start asking about these. Now, because not a lot has been written about these stories at all, I think this particular edition is the first edition of these. They are edited by Carol Tully, who is at least at this time, she was a lecturer in German at the University of Wales. And so this was a new collection at the beginning of the 21st century. I think this is about a 2003, might be earlier than that, slightly earlier than that edition. So there hasn't been a lot of actual looking at. So I had to go a little bit sideways because what there has been a lot of looking at are Grimm's fairy tales. And so this is Romantic period, but this is Romantic period not like English Romanticism. So English Romanticism, you have nature and you have the individual and you have these sorts of ideas of simplicity and beauty, but it's juxtaposed against rationality, enlightenment, and industry. It's a reactive quality to that. Germany also is having this reactive quality, but they are also looking very much into their folk tales and into the concept of what it is to be German. Because unlike England, where England is a unified country already, it is, by the Romantic period, there is a sense of what is English. In fact, there is a sense of what is British, which is a much more unified concept than is even more densely packed, because Englishness just talks about England, but if you talk about Britishness starts to bring in Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland. I don't think the Irish have ever seen themselves as British. They have always been somewhat in opposition to England, so I'm not going to include the Irish in that. But certainly Wales and Scotland is included in the concept of Britishness, which is a concept that had started to gain currency in the early 17th century. So you have a very stable identity when you are looking at English romantics. When you're looking at German romantics, there isn't a Germany. There are a lot of German-speaking states. Germany won't be unified for a very long time yet, about 50 years from this. So Germany as a concept does not yet exist. It's much like, at this period, it's much like Italy. Unlike Italy, Italy has a unifying religion. They have one religion that goes across all the city-states of Italy. Makes it much easier to unify. Germany does not have a unifying religion, and they're also culturally somewhat diverse, because you have cultural differences that have grown up as these states have had quite a lot of autonomy from each other. They have some German states have kings, like Bavaria has a king. Others have other sorts of monarchies, but they're not the same. They've had the 30 Years' War. They fought each other over religious issues and political things. So these are definitely not a unified culturally or religiously. So what are they looking at? Because this is Romanticism, but it's trying to come up with, well, what is German? What is German apart from a common language, which is shared also with the Austrians? The Austrians are the big Germanic centre. Austria. That's where you went. You wanted to do something, you went to Austria, you went to Vienna. You didn't stay in your little provincial German city-state. So this is, well, what are we as not Austrian? Okay, so I think a way to think about this, the way I think about this is these stories are working in much the same way that a writer like Henry Lawson or the Heidelberg School of Painting or Banjo Paterson worked in Australia at the turn of the 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, because Australia was a collection of colonies. When Australia federated in 1901, it became a country, but it hadn't been a country, and there was no actual compulsion that any of these colonies necessarily had a great deal in common. South Australia had the vote for women. Nobody else had the vote for women. Melbourne and Sydney definitely, so New South Wales and Victoria definitely had universities open to women. There were all sorts of different rules and regulations in all the different states, and they all have their own character. They still have their own character. But in order to unify these disparate states, you had, right, well, what is a national mythology? What is a concept of Australia as something, as a thing in and of itself, and not as a colony of Britain? How do we begin to think of ourselves as ourselves? And that's what someone like Henry Lawson or the Heidelberg School were the first ones who could actually paint Australia so that it looked like Australia. Look at the earlier ones, they can't paint gum trees, the light looks wrong, everything looks wrong. Look at the Heidelberg School and you see the sunlight and you see the gum trees and you see Australia. They're beautiful paintings. But they help to create that sense of identity for the nascent nation. These stories and the collection of folk tales that the Brothers Grimm did are also an attempt to create a identity that is German and that they can unify behind. One of the things that you see in this is there is very little mention of any form of Christianity. If it's there, it's very lightly touched on. It's not denominational because, ooh, that's going to cause problems. So it's moving. They are almost all of them in an ill-defined period. You have knights, but you also have these other weird things. So it's not, it's not necessarily medieval, but these are things that you are expecting. So they look sort of high medieval, but it's not really an actual time. It's just sort of a non-time. I think the best thing the thing that I found that they were like when I was reading them was I was thinking, oh, this is like Wagner. This is like reading this is like Lohengrin or the Ring Cycle. Yeah, I want every minute that I have listened to Wagner back, but that's me. But they're like I think of them as somewhat like Wagner, this sort of mythic German that never really existed, but it creates a sense of identity that in order to unify, you need to have an identity to unify behind. Now, one thing that I found really, really interesting while I was looking at actually the Brothers Grimm is an article from 2013 in The Guardian. I'll see if I can link it below, talking about the 200th anniversary of the Brothers Grimm, because the Brothers Grimm were ethnographers. They were trying to record folk tales. And it was talking about how the fact that the fairy tales that the Brothers Grimm had collected are very much less discussed and less focused on in Germany than they are in the rest of the world. And the suggestion that one of the interviewees made was that since the Second World War, these stories have been, we don't want to go there anymore, because while we look at these folk tales as, outside of Germany, everyone outside of Germany, we pick and choose the ones that we like and then go, ugh, that one's a bit icky. And then we modify them so that most people know these stories more from a Disney cartoon than from the original. The actual stories themselves can be incredibly dark, incredibly violent. The interviewee was talking about the fact that these stories reinforced negative concepts of what is German that ultimately led it down a very dark path into fascism, an authoritarian quality. A lot of these stories, yes, there is a lot of, if you were obedient, this wouldn't have happened, or because you were obedient and you followed the rules, this happened. That is something that is both, very good if your story is Little Red Riding Hood and don't talk to strange men in the forest, but not so good if it's don't question authority and do as you're told, and what you're being told to do is awful and you don't question authority. So it is interesting that these stories are both used to create a sense of, here is what it is to be German, but they're also illuminating the shadow side of German culture, the dark side, the Jungian shadow, the part of a society that maybe you don't want to be cultivating, that you're unearthing the shadow, but if you don't process the shadow, it's going to run amok. And that is why these stories, perhaps it's why these stories are not terribly well known, but also why those fairy tales are less celebrated within their own country as they are outside of their country, because German fairy tales are quite dark, and these stories are incredibly dark. It's like, okay, so, well, there's some real nasty stuff in this. Ethelbert kills his friend after telling him his secret because he becomes paranoid about things, and it turns out that his friend isn't actually who he thinks he is, but is the old woman. And there's a lot of weird stuff. They don't even know they're siblings. It is a very weird, dark world. Caspar and Fair Anne is really dark as a story. Undine is dark, but not in the same... people are punished for not following rules, and they're punished pretty severely for rules that are basic human limitations by supernatural forces. But yeah, it is interesting, the idea that having let these stories loose, having preserved them and disseminated them widely and used them as a basis for this is what it is to be German, that you ended up with a whole lot of shadow let loose that was unexamined, celebrated, and according to this interviewer, part of what led down a very dark path, which resulted in their neglect. So I think that's interesting. Would I recommend these? I would recommend Undine. The others, I could take it or leave it. You got to pad out the book somehow. It's only a skinny little book as it is. Undine is good. But these, again, like Elective Affinities, without the cultural context for these, and this does not provide a lot of cultural context, you really struggle. I mean, Mozart's music is glorious in the Magic Flute. I mean, who actually, does anyone watch it with subtitles? Do we not just like listen to it in German and let it filter past and enjoy the nice music? Because these ones aren't even the nice music, is sort of the problem with these I would have. Have a look at them if you are interested in what was happening in German Romanticism at this period. It is very different from English Romanticism. It has different concerns. Those concerns mean that the response is very, very different. But in terms of just pure readability, enjoyment factor, read Undine. Don't worry about the others. I know it's disappointing. It's Goethe, and you sort of think, well, it's Goethe. But yeah, it doesn't hang together so well. It's interesting, but I'd probably read it once. So there you go. Romantic fairy tales from Germany. Next time, we're going back to England with our short things. And next time, we're going to be spending some more time with Alexander Pope. And we're going to do his mock heroic, The Rape of the Lock. So next time I see you, we will be here with Alexander Pope's The Rape of the Lock. Farewell. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.